Hello everyone, my name is Jana Neitsch and my co-author is Niebuhr. And together we submitted this paper on the role of prosody in the production and evaluation of German hate speech. Since nowadays hate speech is a huge problem in societies around the world, especially in the context of social media platforms. Addressing hate speech in the context of social media platforms and the question why it can easily arise on the internet means to focus on both the sender, a writer or speaker, and the recipient, a reader or listener. Firstly, the sender can act completely anonymously on the internet. Secondly, social media posts hardly ever address one specific recipient, but they address anonymous and abstract individuals or groups instead. Additionally, one specific recipient can simultaneously be addressed by an unlimited number of senders. So the anonymity on both sides seem to support the occurrence of hate speech comments, so to say, on the internet. However, the motivation and justification for the regulation of hate speech is linked to the protection of freedom of speech and the human rights of equality and dignity. Hence, it is difficult to decide whether a post is pure hate speech or the expression of a sender's freedom of speech. Nevertheless, that's for sure, hate speech on social media platforms has a strong negative influence on its victims because previous studies have shown that hate speech can result in drastic psychological harm for its victims. For instance, surveys on hate speech in German indicate that every third teenager between the age of 12 and 19 years already had negative experiences on social media platforms. So given the risk of becoming a victim already at a young age, and given that hate speech exerts on pillars of modern civilization, it is surprising that hardly anything is known about the linguistic mechanisms underlying hate speech. In this context, it is important that investigations that are related to the detection of hate speech must also take into account that hate speech is not only associated with written, but also with spoken language. For instance, in political discourse, on football fields, or in videos that are posted on social media platforms. The aims of the present experiment are, firstly, to examine how diversely German hate speech expressions are rated by native listeners of German along two scales, namely the x-axis expressing the participants' personal unacceptability and the y-axis indicating the need for legal and societal consequences. Secondly, to investigate the extent to which prosodic parameter variation can predict hate speech ratings along these two scales. And thirdly, the comparison of the degree of this predictability between the selected lexical and functional embeddings of hate speech to get an idea about the status of prosody in hate speech ratings. For the purposes of our rating experiment, we selected 12 written hate speech items based on authentic written language extracted from our Twitter and Facebook corpus. And the extracted stimuli were used in their original form or original version, hence abbreviated as ORIC items in the following, and in two further versions that will be called feature conditions, irony, IRA items, and Holocaust relations, HOL items. Irony and Holocaust items were taken since they were frequently observed in the corpus, and therefore we designed both feature conditions on the basis of the original items, ORIC items, but in accordance with existing hate speech patterns. That is, for irony items, we prefixed original items with a phrase like, I would never say that. And Holocaust reference items were designed by suffixing original items with throw them into a concentration camp. Overall, the 36 final stimuli were recorded by a professional male native speaker of German who had the profile of a typical hate speaker according to a paper by Jana in 2016, which refers to male Caucasians who are between 35 and 50 years old. Due to his professionalism, the speaker was able to control the prosodic characteristics of the target utterances and to create specific semantic pragmatic effects for each of the 3 feature conditions. Here's an example, starting with the original item, followed by an irony and a Holocaust item.
Muslime sind wie Kuckucksküken. Sie halten ständig den Schnabel auf und fordern. Muslime sind wie Kuckucksküken, die ja gar nie den Schnabel aufhalten und fordern. Muslime sind wie Kuckucksküken. Sie halten ständig den Schnabel auf und fordern. Ab mit ihnen ins KZ.
So we conducted a web-based study for native speakers of German. The participants were asked to indicate the assessment of the spoken hate speech stimuli on the basis of a 2D rating space illustrated here on this slide. And please note that the caption here in the rating space is only shown in order to illustrate the different areas and the strength of the ratings according to the 2 scales. That is, the participants' personal unacceptability on the x-axis increased from left to right, and the need for consequences on the y-axis increased from the bottom to the top. Participants' task was to rate the stimuli by clicking into the rating space, and on the basis of a single click, we could identify the areas with the most clicks over all items and how the different feature conditions were perceived. In total, 28 native speakers of German took part in the study, and most of them practiced non-academic professions and were of different social backgrounds. The participants conducted the experiment individually on their own computer with external loudspeakers, and the experimental session started with a written instruction displayed on screen, and the participants started each trial by clicking on the play button to hear the hate speech utterance, followed by the presentation of the 2D rating space. The hate speech items were played in individually randomized orders. By analyzing the prosodic characteristics of the final recordings and making use of the 2D rating space, we wanted to answer the following research questions. Are there correlations between prosodic characteristics of all 3 feature conditions and participants' click decisions? And with prosodic features, we mean pitch and voice quality features. And voice quality features in terms of harmonic to noise ratio and Hammerberg index, but also speech rate, intensity, and format dispersion, indicating the acoustically perceived body size of the speaker. All of them are known to be related with vocal expressivity. That is, it is highly likely that they are particularly characteristic for spoken hate speech. The second question is whether there are correlations between the prosodic characteristics and participants' ratings. Recordings were analyzed for these phonetic acoustic characteristics. Previous to the statistical analysis, the absolute values of the coordinates were normalized such that we could conduct our analysis with percentage, and we calculated linear mixed effects regression models for the analysis of the ratings and Spearman's correlation to determine the link between the ratings and the prosodic characteristics of the stimuli. Here are the results concerning the prosodic characteristics in all 3 feature conditions Generally, the analysis showed that there is a prosodic variation among spoken hate speech expressions and that hate speech cannot be seen as a communicative function on its own right that is realized with particular prosodic features. More precisely, Holocaust and irony items are realized with a breathier voice and at a lower intensity and mean F0 level compared to original items. Additionally, irony items showed a slower speaking rate and larger F0 range than Holocaust items, and original items showed a higher value for the Hammerberg index than Holocaust and irony items. Regarding the correlations, we found that most of the prosodic characteristics significantly correlated with the rating of hate speech items. Overall, there were more correlations for the consequence scale than for the personal unacceptability scale. For instance, a lower pitch minimum and a slower speaking rate made raters state with more certainty that the hate speech item should have consequences. But there were no effects on the x-axis. We found positive correlations between the pitch maximum and the format dispersion on the one hand and the ratings on both scales on the other hand. That is, the higher the maximum pitch value of the utterance, the higher the unacceptability and the need for consequences. And the higher the impression of the speaker's body size, the higher the values of the ratings for unacceptability and consequences. We found negative correlations between the two voice quality features and the ratings on both scales. For H&R, this means that the breathier the speaker's voice, indicated by lower H&R values, the higher the ratings on the two scales and vice versa. And for the Hammerberg index, the higher the expressivity in the voice, the lower the ratings and vice versa. In the next step, we compared the ratings on both scales between Holocaust and irony items on the one hand and original items as a baseline condition on the other hand. Regarding the unacceptability rating, the analysis showed that Holocaust items were more unacceptable than original items, and irony items were less unacceptable, that is, more acceptable, than original items. Regarding the consequence rating, the analysis indicate that the ratings of Holocaust items showed a higher need for consequences than original items, and the ratings of irony items showed a lower need for consequences than original items. So, overall, the distribution of participants' clicks suggests that Holocaust items triggered the strongest ratings on both scales, while irony items triggered the weakest evaluations on both scales, with original items laying in between these two item classes, as we could see on the previous slides. Overall, the rating results suggest that hate speech can be weakened by the ambiguity of irony, since the lexical string can either be interpreted as either neutral statement or as a statement triggering the opposite meaning, which in turn weakens the overall ratings on both scales. Quantitatively, there were more correlations on the prosodic characteristic of the prosodic characteristics with the y-axis than with the x-axis, suggesting that prosody was or has a greater impact on how strongly hate speech expressions violate societal norms than on how strongly they are rated as personally unacceptable. This might be explained by the assumption that the personal unacceptability ratings are probably more strongly shaped by the wording of the hate speech items themselves. Lower levels of pitch minimum, H&R, Hammerberg index, and speaking rate caused higher ratings of unacceptability and societal consequences. That is, speaking in a calm and determined way, slowly, with a low F0, a breathier voice, and in a less expressive tone made hate speech interpretations stronger and not weaker. And this is similar to what has been found for cold anger in previous studies. The next step is to replicate the web study in Danish and to investigate the differences between both languages, but also with respect to different social classes. For instance, it is interesting to analyze how Danish raters react towards Holocaust items, given that both cultures have a different historical background. And a further question we are interested in is how spoken hate speech influences participants' stress level in terms of biosignals. In order to analyze the perceiver's stress level, we have already started to use heart rate, skin conductance response, breathing patterns, and EEG as online measurements, since participants' online behavior is usually very intuitive and hardly influenceable. So this is the end of the presentation. We are really looking forward to your feedback. Thank you very much for your attention and stay healthy.